Father, we're so thankful for this congregation. We're so thankful for those who labored so hard in years past to make us what we are today, to try to bring glory to your kingdom, bring glory to your name. Father, as I've looked back and looked at the history of this congregation, I see so much you're working through your Holy Spirit to bring people at the right time to the right place, to cause us to grow, not only numerically, but to grow spiritually, especially in this congregation. And as I've seen all the good that this has done, as we've sent people out all over the world that have come through here to learn, to make decisions on what they want to do in your kingdom. We're thankful for that, and we're thankful for your wisdom in sending them to us. These things we thank you and praise you through Jesus Christ. Amen. As you know, we're continuing our Who Are We series. This one's going to be a lot different. We're not necessarily looking so much at doctrine or things that we've done, but sort of the history of how did we get from where the beginning was and to where we are today. And it's a pretty amazing story, at least in my opinion, when you look back and see all the different people and all the different things that happened to get us where we are today. It started with 3 ladies to start with. Actually, it ended up being 4. But the first 3 ladies were Beatrice Crabtree, Mary Edwards, and Neil Lee. And then 2 years later, Margaret Davenport came. Now, Beatrice Crabtree is Edna Carden's mom. Edna Carden, most of you know Edna Carden. I talked to her some about the early years. She said, I can't remember a whole lot about, because I was just a child, but she said, I remember we met in a small log cabin. She thought it was on Duke Street, somewhere along there, and between downtown and Northgate. She said the main thing she remembers about those days was how cold that little log cabin was. She said that was the main thing she remembered about it. Well, what these 3 ladies did when they came together, they decided that they wanted to start a congregation. And so they ran newspaper ads looking for anybody that would have interest in meeting to worship with them. And the word got out to Camp Butner, which is in Butner, North Carolina, about 10 miles north of here. There was a base there, and it served 2 different purposes. They would go there for training before being deployed or being shipped out. This was again during World War II. It also served as a German prisoner of war camp. A little side note to that, most of you probably don't know, but the initial structure of mine and Polly's house, the guy that bought that land and put a house there in 1954 bought 3 of these barracks that used to house German prisoners of war. And he put them together, and it was just a little U-shaped thing when we bought it. But the story was that's where German prisoners of war stayed, in those barracks. So we keep listening for German talk, but we don't ever hear that. But anyway, they were a big part of the beginning of this congregation of what is now Cold Mill Road Church of Christ. They would send people over to worship, and they would help with the Lord's Supper, preaching, whatever they needed to do. And of course, many of them were they were on their way out somewhere to be shipped out. So some of them only were able to come for like 1 service. Others were there for longer periods of times, and they would come more often. Edna also told me a story about, she remembers this as well, that the soldiers coming from Camp Butner, it was a very hard time in the United States. Many of the men had gone off to war. So the wives and ladies were left at home to basically raise the family and support the family. So it was a very difficult time. And she said she remembers these soldiers sneaking food out of Camp Butner to bring to their home so that they would have enough to eat. They were supposed to bury any leftover food, but she said they would bring it to their house. And she said she still remembers that as a child, of these soldiers bringing them food when they came in on Sunday, or if they could get away during the week, they would run by the house and bring them some food. So again, they played a big part in the beginning of what is now Comill Road. Another person who played a big part was Captain Robert Sorrell. He was stationed at Fort Bragg, and he heard about this congregation. And before the war, he was a preacher in Sparta, Tennessee. And when he heard about the congregation, he drove to Durham every Sunday, 75 miles, no compensation, to help start that, especially when he heard it was mostly just the ladies there. And so he would make that drive each Sunday, and he would preach, and he would lead singing, and he would do the Lord's Supper, the prayers. He would do the whole service for them at that time. And while he was there, excuse me, his efforts led to meeting with and studying with the husbands of Neil Lee, which his name was Norwood. We all called him Pappy. He was known as Pappy. Pappy came to church every Sunday morning with chewing gum. I'm sure many of you remember that. And the kids would just flock around Pappy, and he'd be passing out chewing gum to the kids every Sunday morning. He was married to Neil Lee, which was a very spiritual woman, one of the founders of the congregation. And they later in life moved to Texas. That's where she was from, so that she could be back with her family for the latter years of her life. The church, her home church in Texas, also played a large part in starting the congregation. And that Captain Sorrell talked to the preachers there in Anson, Texas, which was Neil Lee's home church, to see about helping get started, that they needed a building. So by 1949 or so, it had grown to around 25 adults. And so they came then from Anson, Texas. A group came. They supplied money and resources, and they purchased property on Watt Street, which is not far from here. It's right there by Northgate Mall. The little building still stands there. So in 1950, they constructed what was then known as Watt Street Church of Christ. That's where it was. That's where, when Polly and I first came in '68, they were meeting there at that building, which is, like I say, is still there today. The church began to grow. Not only was Pappy converted, but Mary Edwards' husband, Abe, we call him Abe, he was also converted. And then Bob Davenport came in later too, Margaret Davenport's husband. So it began these men took a very active role once they were converted. They took a very active role in the church there. They started off doing, again, they ran newspaper ads, but they also had a radio program that they started. And started a radio program in 1952 or 3, I think it was. And they also started doing a lot of volunteer work. The ladies had a group that got together to sew clothes, again, that they would provide for those who were less fortunate in the neighborhoods, and that was a big part of it. They also, a few years later, worked in the Edgemont community, which was a very poor part of the neighborhood, and they would work there at the Edgemont Community Center. They would provide classes in teaching children on hygiene and some of the parents on money management. They would also take them on tours of Durham, on picnics. They would have Bible stories that they would have there at the center. So that was another big part of the early church, was a lot of the volunteer work. After the completion of the building in 1950, the preacher from Anson, Texas came down, and they held the first gospel meeting. There used to be a lot of those back in those days, a lot of gospel meetings. Some people call them revivals or whatever. But again, all of this started the growth of the church at that time. In 1967, they elected their first elders. There were 3 elders at that time. Carl Bohannon, which everybody called Cotton, and Gerald Camp and Harold Phillips. Carl Bohannon left about a year after Polly and I got here and moved to Roxborough, and David Young then, who was a physician at Duke, he was appointed an elder in 1969. 1968 was a very difficult year for the whole country, really, but Durham was no exception. There was a lot of racial unrest. They had rioting in Durham at the time. There were some buildings that were burned. It just so happened that the Carolina lectureships were going to be held here in Durham that year. And so we had ministers coming in from all over the state for these lectureships, and a curfew was placed. So George McWhirter, who was the minister at that time, along with Tiny Camp, who was Gerald Camp's wife, and Phyllis Rourke's sister, they stayed at the building at that time, and all these ministers were coming in, and so they got permission to stay at the building past the curfew time. And also then the Chapel Hill Church was going to provide housing for about 25, I think. But they had to get to Chapel Hill, and there was a curfew. So they talked to them, and they gave them permission and had the National Guard escort them to their places where they were staying. The curfew was lifted on Monday, and so they were able to then complete the lectureships. In 1968 through 72, you see where it says South Boston, Virginia. One of the members here, a family, Pete and Hazel Browning, Hazel had a sister that lived in South Boston, and they were trying to start a congregation there. And so they asked if we could help. Again, it was very small. I know when we were going there, it was about 15 people. They met in a little storefront, little store that they had rented, a little shopping place, I guess it was. They had a little room set aside that they could use. And each Sunday, I think it was every Sunday, some of you that went there with us, we had some men rotate through there. And every Sunday we would provide a speaker, a preacher. And they had a person that could lead singing, but if he wasn't there, we had to provide both the song leader and the preacher. So from 1968 to 1972, we had men from Coal Mill Road go up there each week and provide, thank you, Ezekiel, and provide, good time to take a swallow, isn't it? And provide that for them until they, by 1972, they were able to hire a preacher. We're large enough to go on from there. So that was one of the early works where we provided manpower, if you might want to call it that, and also financial aids. And we'll look at later all the various places that we did help other congregations get started. So in 1972, we had decided that Watt Street was not large enough. We had grown to the point that we were bursting at the seams there. So we started looking for land to purchase. And from things I've read, Abe Edwards was a big part of helping us find this land here on Coal Mill Road, which is where we are now. We purchased 8 acres of land on Coal Mill Road. We sold part of it a few years later to what is now where the Mormon church is. But then we started with the initial building of what is now our fellowship hall. Want to commend Bob Jones. He played a big part in overseeing this. This was a man that was probably working 70 to 80-hour weeks as a heart surgeon and coming here to try to ride herd. And when he couldn't do it, I heard Kathy had to come out here and break up a fight or something one time. She's told the kids to stay in the car in case they started throwing bricks. And also, Kathy, I started to ask Kathy if I could tell this story, but then I said no, because she'd tell me no, don't tell it. So I thought I would tell it and ask for forgiveness later. But she said Bob came home one day, and as we were building that, and they had run over on the cost. So Bob said, I need you to sign this paper. Kathy looked at it and said, what is this? I said, well, we've got to borrow some more money, and they've got to have somebody's name on there. And she said, I'm not going to sign that. She said, we could lose everything. And anyway, he convinced her to sign it. And so we owe a big deal of thanks to Bob and Kathy for putting their life on the line there so that we could complete the construction of what is now our fellowship hall and classrooms. November 2nd, 1974 was our first worship service in what is now our fellowship hall. Again, Bob Jones steps up for us again from 1974 to 1979. We really couldn't afford to pay a preacher. So since Bob was only doing 80 hours a week in work, we decided to ask him to preach too. So Bob was our preacher from 1974 to 1979. And again, we want to thank you, Bob, for all the things you've done for this congregation through the years. In 1975, there were some of our members that started let me find this where I'll be sure and get it right here. Group home for adolescent girls. Yeah, there you go. A residential facility for 5 emotionally disturbed teenage girls. And Dan Blazer, which is Trey Blazer's dad, and Charles Holton and a former member, Joe McCord, formed the original board of directors for that. And then we had several members who acted as house parents for these children. And that went on for many years. When did it finally end, Charles? Early 80s. Well, I've got down here that you served on the board until 85. So, all right. And by the way, if some of you here have some stories I know that I don't know, if we get to a period of time that there's something you would like to say or to tell us, please raise your hand, because I need all the help I can get in trying to put all of this together. Because there's no way, when I got to thinking, and I really enjoyed this because it brought back so many memories of people especially. I can still see faces that some of them I can't remember their names, of all of the people who have come through here through the years that played a large part in our congregation for the short periods of times that they were here. So it's another way we can see the blessing of God's kingdom and how it is spread throughout the world in that way. In 1977 to 79, we had some internal difficulties. The eldership had some disagreements on direction and so forth was one of the things which I guess brings to my mind that, we'll soon be going out for elders here for your recommendations. It's so important in choosing elders that, I think too many times in the past we chose somebody because they were here every Sunday and they had children. They had believing children, and they thought, well, that was the qualifications they needed. But there's so much more to that. If you have a divided eldership, you're going to have a divided congregation. There's no way around it. So again, choose wisely, not someone with all the answers, but someone who is willing to be an elder to all the congregation, not just somebody that agrees with them or thinks this is the direction the congregation ought to go and not listen to all sides. So be sure and keep that and be praying about that as we go through that in the coming year. Anyway, there was a group of 3 elders that left, and some people left with them and began a congregation they called Ladder Road Congregation. And also during that time, we had a lot of students that came from the Gainesville, Florida It was what later was called the Boston movement. Steve Pipkin was their minister. They came, they brought a lot of growth of young students, but were very demanding of those students and of the congregation, to where it caused a lot of difficulties that they felt like everything ought to be done the way they say it ought to be done. And so it caused a lot of unrest within the congregation, and so finally they left as well. So that was one of the first big divisions we had within the church. And any division is very painful. I don't care how large or how small it is, it's always painful to everybody that's involved. And then
campus ministry at that point that had between 75 and 100 students at one time.
Yeah, it was a very, very large campus ministry work that was going on. So I say there was a lot of good done, but it was, and it's amazing. Many of those who were part of that have since left that movement, you might say. We still hear, Polly and I just heard on Thanksgiving Day, one of our former students that came during that time gave us a call that lives out in Seattle, that they're still working churches but have gotten away from what had then become the International Church of Christ. And then in 1978, the prison ministry began. We got a call from someone wanting the Lord's Supper served, and so there was permission given to send somebody out to serve the Lord's Supper, which then grew into someone going all the time. So we had a group of people. Of course, you got to go through all of the requirements to get in there, the background checks, the whole works before you can go into the prison. And there was a group of us that would go into the prison. That ministry went on for many, matter of fact, still going on through our Latino congregation. They still go to the ministry there. And also I think there's some from the Central Church of Christ that still go out to the prison ministry, because many of them helped start that in the beginning. So that ministry has been going on for a long time and has really grown through the years from a very humble beginning to what it is today. 1980, and let me keep watching the time here because we don't have a bell over here. 1980, Bob Jones, Mike Russell, and Bill Weatherly were appointed elders. And that brought a little stability towards our eldership after a lot of division within the eldership. So that I highlighted that because I thought that began to make a change within our eldership that really brought about some very positive things. 1982, I've got Southside Church of Christ, and I think most of us are familiar with our brothers and sisters with Southside Church of Christ. What many of you don't know is that the way that congregation started was that we within Coal Mill Road decided we wanted to go out into the black communities and try to build up our membership, to try to bring unity between black and white in our communities. And this congregation has always been that way. When I first came, I was surprised back at Watt Street. And like I say, Polly and I came in 1968, and there was a black family here then. And this was right during all of the racial unrest. I still remember, Paul English was his name, very spiritual man, good, and he preached one Sunday, and I still remember his sermon. He preached on let your righteousness exceed that of the Pharisees. And I still remember that sermon. And it was the first time that I had actually been in a church, because my home church growing up, we had a black congregation in the same town that every once in a while we would have like a revival and invite them for that, and some would come or we would go there. But it was the first time that actually had a member of the congregation. And so I thought that was very unusual and very encouraging to see that. And so again, I want to thank our elders at that time that wanted to try to increase our numbers here at Coal Mill Road. So we brought in Clifford Davis, who was an evangelist from Florida, and held a revival. It was held at the AME church there on Fayetteville Street. Many of you, or some of you, were here and remember those days. And before that, we went into the black communities, knocking on doors and inviting people, and had some Bible studies, and that's how that all started. It was very successful, so successful that they wanted to start their own congregation. And which I understand that now. We were hoping to build up our congregation here to have the mixture that we wanted to have, that we would have it be open to all people, that we're all one in Christ. We're all brothers and sisters, and we shouldn't be here and there and so forth. That was what we wanted to do. But again, it was growing so much that some of the leaders there that helped start, which Emma, you remember, Emma and Isaac were there. Isaac's one of the leaders over there at Southside now. They came to us and said, we're just not going to get people to come over to Coal Mill Road. I just don't think we will. We would have more effectiveness if we were in our own community. And so that was how that all came about, that Southside was then formed and has been thriving ever since. Okay. 1983, Paul Watson comes on the scene. And Paul became our pulpit minister and has served for many years. We'll get, on another slide, we'll get to when he retired the first time. And of course, again, Paul brought a lot of stability in a lot of different ways. We'd had several different preachers. After Bob, we finally were able to hire, I think we had 2 or 3 between that period of time before we hired Paul. And so he's meant a lot to our congregation as well. 1987, the Annex building, which is what it was originally called, we now call it the Latino building, was built. And it's the far building down there at the top of the hill where the Latino has their worship service. Again, we were growing. Our numbers were growing. We felt like we needed more space. We were looking for a fellowship hall. So the top floor of that, and for some of you who maybe have not been in that building, used to be our fellowship hall. It's where the Latinos have their worship service now, but it was our fellowship hall. We had a kitchen in there. During that period of time, somewhere in that same range of time is when we started what is now our care groups. And we would have, when we had such a large college group, we would have every Sunday have a meal up there for the college group. And at that time, Belinda Mangum was in charge of coordinating all of that, did an excellent job for many years of coordinating those meals and for our college students and so forth. So, and then we had classrooms downstairs. We had our offices downstairs in that building. But then, as we'll get to in a few minutes, you'll see that we finally turned that building over to the Latino group. Our building usage. When we built these buildings, we've always said that we wanted it open to the community as much as possible. That we didn't want just a place, have a building sitting here to be used twice a week. If there's other groups that want to use our building, we want to make it available for them. And so things like the Divorce Recovery Support Group, which our members started. I don't see Pat here. Pat Daggett was one of the main ones with that, and there was another, Bonnie Phillips was here, was one of the teachers of that class, and it was very successful. Some of the marriage counselors in town would send their people here to meet with that group. I know a man that I worked with, I suggested it to him, and he came here after he was going through a divorce. So it was very successful, and they did that ministry for many years. Alcoholics Anonymous would meet, use our building. Anxiety Disorders Support Group. It's been used all these years as a polling precinct, a place to come and vote. Animal Protection Society, Girl Scouts, Brownies, 4-H, AARP, there's been a lot of different groups that have used our buildings through the years to have their meetings and so forth. So we wanted to make our buildings available to the community. Then sharing our resources. We not only provided financial help to many churches starting in North Carolina, but we provided people, which much like what we did in South Boston, we also did in Roxborough, in Henderson, in Charlotte, North Carolina, the North Raleigh congregation. Of course, Southside, we helped Ladder Road once they left here. We helped them get started. Same way with Central congregation when they left. We let them use some of our building for a short while till they could find a place. So I think the Lord has blessed us in so many ways with so many gifted and talented people that we had the resources to send to these other parts of the state who were trying to start just like we did back in 1944. What started with these few women, these 3 or 4 women, to grow into what it is today. And each one of these congregations, began very small, and they needed help. And so we sent help to those various places.
Dean, one more to add there. We supported Dennis Connor, the current minister in Raleigh Brooks.
That's right.
In Statesville for many years.
Yeah, up in Statesville. Any others that you can think of? Those were just some that I remembered. Anyway, we still provide those resources, and I guess this is a good time to point out how the Lord sends us people. We've got people sitting in here today that the Lord has sent us, even though it's going to be for a short period of time. Last Tuesday, when Matt and Shanna were leaving, they stopped by the house, and Matt was saying, "You'll never know how much this congregation has meant to us." When he came here, he was sort of struggling as to what to do. Did he want to go back in the Army? Did he want to go become a preacher? Did he want to go into law enforcement? That was sort of what he was juggling. And we helped him, this congregation helped him make that decision to find a position in the Lord's kingdom somewhere, that the gifts and the things that he's been studying for that he could use. So I think we fail to realize all of the good things that come out of this congregation. And even though we're sad to see people go, and again, when I was thinking back on this, if half the people would have stayed here that have been through here, this building would not hold everybody. I mean, it's been that many people. During one period of time when we were without a preacher, we had a guy named Randy Chestnut who was preaching. He and Dwayne Warden, who'd came here for classes, for study. I saw Randy Chestnut about 2 or 3 years ago on television, on the History Channel. They were talking about, I think, Jesus' life or something, and they had this professor from Pepperdine University, Dr. Randy Chestnut. I thought, I know him. So again, we've got people all over this world, missionaries, preachers. Polly and I, again, on one of our trips to Texas about 4 years ago, stopped in Nashville to have see friends, and they had other ex-Coal Mill Road alumni come that night. Some of you remember the Atwells, Homer and Joe Reed Dudley, the older Shrigley's. We saw them when we were there, Doug and Nan Smith. There were 3 or 4 elders sitting at that table that night that had come through Coal Mill Road in their earlier days. And again, they consider Coal Mill Road where they got their footing, where they got, pushed into, you might say, or encouraged to use the gifts that they've been given. We've got that same blessing today with all of our divinity students that come here. They add so much to our congregation, and we look forward to hearing about their lives in the future and where they go in God's kingdom. So it's something, even though we might not be large in numbers, I think it's something that we've realized what our calling is, and that's to prepare other people to go into other parts of the world for this kingdom. What time are we in? 11:45? And additional elders were appointed. 1986, Paul Watson. I was appointed in 1990, and Charles Holton in 1992. And so that sort of became the nucleus of the eldership at that time, along with Bob and Mike and Anna. Mike had to move to Indianapolis or to Indiana, and so he had stepped down from the eldership. Then in 1996 is when we purchased the Bradley property, which is up top of the hill where Jorge Aguilera lives. We purchased that property in 1996, and that became a place for Jorge and his family to live. 1997 is the Latino work was established. It originally started with a young couple, Luis and Michelle Pineda, were members here, and we had a lot of Latinos coming into the Durham area, and so we talked with them about starting Latino work. And so they were the initial beginnings of this. And then the Lord sent us Jorge. Jorge came here to work with Dr. Shattuck on learning some new medical procedures or something, because he was a medical doctor in Honduras. And he decided he wanted to stay. And so Jorge stayed, became the preacher, eventually was able to get his whole family here. They were helped through all the processes that they had to go through and to become citizens and so forth. And so that began that work, which again, as we all know, is still happening today. And so in 2000 is when Jorge becomes full-time Latino minister. He came a couple of years before that, I think, but he became full-time in the year 2000. 2000 we began mission trips to Honduras. Again, Phil Shattuck, who was a former member here, had a lot to do with getting that started. And I know Charles has been deeply involved with that as well. Jorge still goes a couple of times a year to Honduras. Our own Jane Campbell goes every year to Honduras. So there's still missions going there that some of our people are involved with. Then in 2001, we purchased the house on the corner, which is where Jonathan and Haley are living now. And we had wanted that property for quite a while, but it never had become available. And it just seemed funny to have a house sitting right in front of our corner lot there. So I think that was a good purchase on our part. October 2003 was our first worship service in this building, our new worship center. So again, we had sort of outgrown the fellowship hall. Our numbers were getting large enough that it was hard to get everybody in there and feel comfortable at least. So we then looked for adding. We already had this property here, just a matter of adding this building to it. And then November 2004 began our gender inclusive worship. And that was something that took place over many years. Most of you probably don't know that the issue was first studied back probably in the 80s would be the first time we studied it. There was not agreement on whether the congregation was ready for that. And matter of fact, that had caused earlier some of the strife earlier that to even study that issue. There were people some of the elders at that time felt you shouldn't study anything that was controversial. And so that had caused some of the internal problems, which is one thing, again, I commend our eldership today of anything's open to study, to be able to study even though it might be a difficult issue or an issue that maybe you haven't always heard the other side. It's always good to hear the other side on all of these issues. So again, another important point to remember. Then in 2004, we did another study, much more in-depth study, and it went on for I think 13 weeks, where we met in here. Paul led most of those sessions. And we did a study with the congregation, and then we did a survey. where people would actually answer questions that we had on this survey concerning gender inclusive. And it came back close to 70% thought that it was a good thing to do. And so we made that. There were some exceptions that didn't have as high support on women preaching or women elders. So at that time we had decided, well, we would not allow women to preach, but we said, again, this is where patience, I guess, pays off, if you can call it that. Rather than trying to force these issues, we tried to be patient and pray about these things. And then when we felt like the time was right is when we would make these decisions. As you know now, the women are open to all aspects of our congregation and our worship, and that we have women who have preached, and we look forward to having more women who will produce sermons here at this congregation. But that was a very difficult time too, and a very trying time for the whole congregation. Additional elders then were appointed in 2001, Wayne Massey, 2006, Carl Lafferty and Tim Wood, 2011, John Byron, Neil Clay. So them, along with myself and Charles and Paul and Bob, made up the nucleus of the eldership. And I think, again, brought more stability to the eldership. I can't say enough about my fellow elders. We've worked well together. We don't always agree, believe it or not. We've had some pretty heated, I don't know if you'd call them arguments, but discussions on what direction we should go and things that we should do. But we always come out of there united. And that's the main thing, of being able to, it's not my way, it's not your way, it's our way. And that's what we've got to always remember. And so that made up the eldership at that time. And then June of 2007, like I say, Paul Watson retired for the first time as our pulpit minister. Each time we needed a minister, though, because we had one that didn't stay too long. We had to call Paul back into service. He's always been willing and able to fulfill that job. And so, again, we've got so many thanks to Paul because then he stepped in again after the Messers left. So he's been called out of retirement at least 2 or 3 times now. And so we're really thankful for that. June of 2011 is when Patrick Messer becomes our pulpit minister and Sharon Hilliard becomes our youth and family minister. Again, can't say enough good things about them. I think they meant a lot to our congregation. Sharon still leads that and does an excellent job in being our youth and family minister. Puts in I know a lot more hours than what she's getting paid for, and just they've become a vital part of our congregation. And then in 2012, Bob Jones and Paul Watson retired from the eldership. And we missed them. We missed their wisdom. But they felt like it was time for them to step aside. 2016 is when we first hosted IHN, and I think that's our families moving forward now. Luke and Caroline and Tim Wood played such a big part in that. And overseeing that to this day, and the work that they do there needs to be commended. And then November 2016, the Messer family moves to Lincoln, Nebraska. We all hated to see them leave, but we took our time, as we all know. For 2 years we took our time trying to find the right fit for our congregation. And so with that, we welcome Ben and Laura to our church family as our new minister, and look forward to, I think we've all very happy that you're part of our family now, and we look forward to our years together. And hopefully this gives you some of the background as to where we've come from and what our emphasis has been. And again, I can't stress enough, I think we fail to realize what our congregation has done for the kingdom of God not just in this place, but throughout the world. And it's something that we can be thankful for. And it has sort of become our mission statement, you might say, of equipping the saints for ministry, which we have taken from Ephesians, the 4th chapter. I want to read a couple of verses there where we've taken that from, and that will conclude our class. It was Christ who gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some to be evangelists, and some to be pastors and teachers, to prepare God's people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God, and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Thank you very much.